The Kurds are fighting for their land, just so you understand. They're fighting for their land. And as somebody wrote in a very, very powerful article today, they didn't help us in the Second World War. They didn't help us with Normandy, as an example. In addition to that, we have spent tremendous amounts of money on helping the Kurds in terms of ammunition, in terms of weapons, in terms of money, in terms of pay. With all of that being said, we like the Kurds.
Mr. President, the Kurds helped the U.S. defeat ISIS, and by allowing this offensive, is it going to be more difficult in future times of need to develop alliances?
No, it won't be. It won't be at all. Alliances are very easy. But, you know, our alliances have taken advantage of us. If you look at how much money we spend on NATO and how much money countries from Europe, who are really a much bigger beneficiary than we are, okay? You know, they're there and we're here. We're many miles away. Our alliances, in many cases, have taken tremendous advantage of us. If you look at NATO, I got them to pay $100 billion more. Out of the 28 countries, 20 of them are delinquent. You know what the delinquent means? That's an old real estate term. He's delinquent with his rent. They're delinquent with their payment. They owe us a tremendous amount of money, and they never pay us back. They owe us hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars. So, no, I don't look at it that way.
Joining us now, former U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations and former National Security Advisor to President Obama, Susan Rice. She's out with her new memoir, Tough Love, My Story of Things Worth Fighting For, and look forward to talking about that. I just have to start, though. So many questions I could ask you, but why don't I start with, are alliances easy?
No, Mika. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Alliances take hard work. They are a two-way street. And that clip that you just played encapsulates the rot at the center of Donald Trump's foreign policy. He has no conception of how America has been strong and a global leader over the course of the last decades. It's because we have an unmatched network of alliances and partnerships, countries that are willing to join with us when we face a challenge, whether it's after 9/11, whether it's to defeat ISIS, whether it's to fight Ebola or deal with the resurgent Russia. We need allies. And because he trashes them at every opportunity, and now having thrown the Kurds under the bus, he is making us weaker. And he is making countries in the world far less willing to trust in our leadership and want to join with us when we need them most.
Ambassador, it's Willie Geist. It's good to talk to you this morning. I just want to get your perspective as someone who served very closely alongside President Obama on matters of national security about the process here. And all the reporting is that President Trump got a phone call from President Erdogan the other night. President Erdogan prevailed on the President of the United States to unilaterally make this decision to pull back troops and to let Turkey into northeast Syria, that the Chief of Staff, Mick Mulvaney, scrambled to call the Secretary of Defense to tell him that this was happening. In other words, the Secretary of Defense was not consulted. There was no process. It was the whim of one man.
Well, that's exactly what we've seen throughout the Trump administration. It's frightening. And one of the things I try to do in the book is to remind Americans what a proper national security decision-making process looks like, whether in the Obama administration, a Bush administration, or a Clinton administration. It doesn't mean that every decision is made perfectly, but it means that the analysis, the assessment, the intelligence is done properly, and due consideration is given to the risks and benefits of various different options, and a rational decision gets made, and then it gets rolled out in a responsible fashion with our allies consulted, Congress consulted, in something other than a tweet. This man has arrogated unto himself all authority out of complete and utter ignorance or craven self-interest, and has made decisions like this one which don't take account of anything relevant to our national interest.
You know, Ambassador Rice, I know it will shock you, but sometimes we on this show and other shows sit back and we make judgments and assessments of presidents and leaders. But without thinking about what Henry Kissinger said, that sometimes there are no right answers. Sometimes you have to choose between two bad choices. It seems that Syria always presents that opportunity. Since you've been on the book tour, you faced criticism about Syria, and yet I remember an NPR interview where hearing you say that actually your biggest disappointment was Syria. Can you talk about that country, still a troubling situation, and talk about the bad choices that you all had to sift through in trying to move forward with a policy there, a policy that many people still criticize today?
Well, Joe, yes, I write at length about the challenges we faced in Syria and how we wrestled with them. And I say that in my judgment, anyway, Syria was and remains the toughest policy problem that we faced, whether we were dealing with the threat of chemical weapons, which in fact, we did manage to get 1,300 metric tons of those chemical weapons out, or whether we wrestled with the civil war where there was no satisfactory answer. But, you know, today we're talking about ISIS. And, of course, it was the fight against ISIS was one that President Obama initiated, got 65 or more of our partners and allies to join with us, and put ISIS on the path to defeat. President Trump came in and continued that fight appropriately. And now all of a sudden, when Erdogan places a phone call and asks President Trump for this extraordinary capitulation to our partners and allies, President Trump said yes. And you have to wonder why. It's not just because he's sick and tired of wars in the Middle East. This is a very economical investment that the United States has made with very minimal U.S. personnel on the ground. We learned the lesson the hard way in Iraq and elsewhere that when you work with partners, and the Kurds were our partners, they were the pointy end of the spear doing the fighting. We were advising and training. So this was a very wise investment proportionate to the risk that we faced from ISIS. And now he's upended all of that.
Well, an extraordinary investment, a wise investment, a measured investment, and a sustainable investment that actually kept Russia, Syria, Turkey, Iran, and ISIS in check. Hard to criticize that. I want to go back to Syria one more time, though, just for leaders who were watching and what they need to get out of your book when you're reading that crisis. Because I remember on the show we would report 10,000 people dead in the civil war in Syria, 20,000, 40, then it was 100, then it was 200,000. And I'm just wondering, with the gift of hindsight, if you could go back, is there something we could have done to prevented that killing, or is it like Vietnam? I remember after watching Ken Burns' documentary on Vietnam, I just said, my God, there is nothing we could have done. That war was doomed from the start.
Well, Joe, I think it's very hard to look back, even on something as proximate as the civil conflict in Syria, and say with certainty, and I don't aim to do this, that nothing could have been done differently. I point out in various places that I think, for example, in Syria, that at times we created a gap between our rhetoric and expectations and actions in terms of follow-up. But I also wrestle very directly in Tough Love with the question of, should we have intervened militarily, the United States, in Syria's civil war? We provided extraordinary amounts of humanitarian assistance. We trained and equipped and supported the rebels. We supported the neighboring states. We were actively engaged for years in robust diplomacy trying to end that conflict. But President Obama made the decision, and in fact he made it multiple times as we confronted this, that weighing the risks and the benefits of the United States deploying ground forces in another conflict at a massive scale necessary to depose Assad, and this would have had to be before the Russians intervened, that weighing those risks and benefits, he determined that it was not in the aggregate in the United States' interest to get involved in that civil war directly with our own forces. I know how painful that decision was for him and for all of us who were part of it. I say there were no easy answers, and nobody can feel good about the outcome. But in all honesty, Joe, and I wrestled with this as I wrote the book and thought through how I feel about it, I don't think that was the wrong choice. I think we'd be in a very, very different place had the president decided to get actively involved militarily with U.S. forces on the ground in Syria. And that would be what it would have taken to depose Assad. as we found in Iraq, quite frankly.
Yeah, I was going to say, there also is the context of being in Afghanistan for over a decade, the tragedy of Iraq, all of the mistakes that were made in Iraq. Do you suspect the decision may have been different if America had not been in those two quagmires for a decade?
More than a decade, in the case of Afghanistan.
Right.
And yes, of course, Iraq. But I think, Joe, I think that's yes, but I think it's hard to weigh, because what we learned from Iraq, and to a different and lesser extent from Afghanistan, is the extraordinary price of fighting a terrorist threat or deposing a dictator in the case of Iraq, where it requires hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands, right, over 100,000 U.S. ground forces there on a sustained basis in bloody conflict, as in places like Fallujah. So, I mean, I personally, like President Obama, in fact, opposed the original Iraq war, because I didn't think that it was a war to deal with terrorists in the first instance, or weapons of mass destruction. I thought it was correct to go into Afghanistan after 9/11 and to deal with the terrorist threat there. But in both cases, we've seen that it's a very, very deadly and costly endeavor. What we learned from Iraq and Afghanistan and applied in Syria is that we can fight terrorists with partners, what the military calls by, with, and through partners. And that's why the Kurds were such valuable allies. They took that fight to ISIS. And when Donald Trump says we gave them tens of millions of dollars or billions of dollars in equipment and training, we didn't give them that. They fought for us, and we enabled them to fight on our behalf. If that is not a smarter way to deal with a terrorist threat, I don't know what is.
Ambassador Rice, it's Jonathan Lemire. Congrats on the book. Switching gears to Ukraine, you obviously worked in the Obama administration with Vice President Biden. I have two questions for you. First, set the record straight in terms of the prosecutor who was fired in Ukraine and how that came about. But secondly, was the Obama administration aware that Hunter Biden was working in Ukraine at the time, and was that appropriate?
That information, I think, Jonathan, as you know and others have documented, was in the public domain at the time. But going back to Vice President Biden's role, Vice President Biden was executing declared, clear-cut, transparent U.S. government policy on behalf of the administration, on behalf of President Obama. He was executing a policy that had strong bipartisan backing in Congress, which was to root out corruption at a time when the United States and our Western partners and the IMF were trying to provide billions of dollars to help establish and support the new government in Ukraine. So he was transparently pursuing U.S. government policy. That's in stark contrast to what Donald Trump did, which was to try to extort the Ukrainian government with up to $400 million in U.S. military assistance that they desperately needed because they're in a hot war still with Russia, and utilizing a White House visit not to advance U.S. interests and U.S. policy, but to advantage himself politically against his perceived opponent. That is entirely different, and then tried to hide it on a classified system that is not suited for that kind of communication. So these are apples and oranges. This is a classic Donald Trump effort to lie, to distort, to confuse, and you know, we have to be responsible consumers of that information based on facts and distinguish between lies and reality.
So, Ambassador, based on all you've said and all you've seen, do you believe President Trump should be impeached?
Willie, I think that every day, including this past few days with selling out our Kurdish partners and basically giving a bunch of ISIS terrorists a get-out-of-jail-free card to attack our partners in Europe and potentially here come to the United States. I can't begin to quantify the number of abuses that this president has committed in broad daylight. I support the impeachment inquiry. I think it's absolutely necessary at this point, but I think it's wise to let the inquiry play out and the facts emerge, and then members of Congress can make a decision as to how they'd vote. I don't have that vote.
You talk in your book, Ambassador Rice, about joining the Clinton administration with a baby on your hip. the challenges of balancing work and family life, which I know Mika will want to talk about. But you also talk about a certain encounter with Richard Holbrooke. Tell us about it.
Well, there were multiple encounters with Richard Holbrooke. I think the one you're referring to...
Well, the one where you flipped him off.
Yeah. the one where that one.
Oh, my gosh.
That came, yes, after he declared in our very first meeting, which began when he staked out my office and sat there for an hour, and he greeted me and I greeted him, and he said, you know, I already dislike you because you've beaten my record as the youngest regional assistant secretary of state. Our relationship went downhill from there, quite frankly, Joe. And as I write in the book, my father taught me something from a very young age that I have taken to heart, which is don't take crap off of people. And so when in a meeting some months later, he bullied me and tried to denigrate me in the middle of a policy dispute in front of about 6 or 7 ambassadors who were my direct reports, who were 20 to 30 years my senior. He said very sarcastically, dripping with contempt, I remember when I, too, was a young assistant secretary. And rather than respond in words, I responded with a gesture that he pretended not to see, but I'm quite sure he did see. And then I excused myself a few minutes later, because I figured I'd better tell the Secretary of State and National Security Advisor that their assistant secretary had just flipped off a member of the cabinet. And when I reported that, I must say that the response was more than encouraging.
It happens. Willie?
I want to ask you about another encounter in the book, page 382, 2015 White House Correspondents' Dinner. I hadn't seen this reported previously, but this is about 6 weeks before Donald Trump declared his candidacy for the presidency, and you describe a scene where you're seated at a table and a big man comes up behind you, grabs you by the shoulders and whispers something to you.
Well, Willie, he grabs me by the shoulders and sort of pulls me up out of my chair, and I turn around to find that it's Donald Trump. And then he hugs me. I've never seen this man in person before, never met him. He hugs me, and while he's hugging me, he whispers into my ear, I think you were very unfairly treated over Benghazi, and you're doing a great job for the country. And I couldn't have been more shocked, both by the hug, which was, I hasten to say, the hug itself was not gross, but the whole thing was kind of creepy because I'd never met this man before. But then what he said was most striking because, as you know well, he spent many months and years before that, and then every day since, assailing President Obama, questioning his citizenship, and trashing people like me who served with him, with the president every day. So it was a remarkable encounter and an early indication, I guess, of the gap between what Donald Trump says privately and what he actually thinks and what he says publicly.
His hugs can be gross. No, I've gotten one. Susan, I love this part in your book where you talk about being a breastfeeding mom at the State Department and ruffling some feathers. Talk about that, because you were working, and we all know, I mean, my dad had your job. It's 24/7. It's not like you can put things aside.
Right. Well, just to be clear, Mika, I wasn't breastfeeding as National Security Advisor.
Right.
I was a little bit
No, but all
past
these
that time.
jobs are 24/7.
As Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, I started that job when our son Jake was 3 months old. And thankfully, I was serving under Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, our first female Secretary of State, who was extremely supportive. But I had to wrestle with, what do? I didn't want to stop breastfeeding at 3 months. I wanted to be able to do that as long as I possibly could, and so I brought Jake to the State Department, and he would come occasionally for feedings, and when I couldn't feed him personally, I would be pumping and storing my milk. Everybody out there, every mother out there understands what this is about. I also spent time with Jake, tried to walk with him in the halls of the State Department. That's where he learned to walk, pushing a little truck as a push toy. And we'd walk by these offices in the State Department on the 6th floor down the hall from my office, and horrified people would look out the door at us as if we had, pooped on the carpet or something. It was a strange culture. And I do think that, in addition to being very young in that role, being a breastfeeding mother raised some eyebrows. But I frankly didn't care. I felt like, I had to do what I had to do for my son, and I didn't diminish my ability to do my job. And if there were some people who didn't like it, well, then that was going to be their problem.
Jobs are 24/7. Is Jake now the one at Stanford?
Yes.
As president of the College Republicans?
Yes, that's the one. He's past president of the Stanford College Republicans, but his views have not changed dramatically from that point. Yeah, I've got 2 kids, Mika. I've got the wonderful Jake at Stanford and a wonderful daughter, Maris, who's almost 17 years old. They have dramatically different political perspectives. And I'm very proud of both of them and love them both very much.
Another thing you have in common, my dad had Susan Rice's job, and my brother Ian is a Republican, my brother Mark is a Democrat, and then there's me all over the place in the middle. But it's great to have a family that can have great debates.
Well, we do have those, among other things.
Yes, some of them can get out of hand. But anyhow, the book is Tough Love, My Story of Things Worth Fighting For. Ambassador Susan Rice, thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you guys for having me. It's great to be with you.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.